We left off talking about torsion, that 180-degree twist in gastropod anatomy that causes many of the organs to be shifted to one side. Again, this may have been an adaptation to allow snails to pull their head into the shell first, protecting their vital organs. Or, more likely, it evolved as a way to offset that imbalance that's caused by the mantle secreting the shell more on one side than the other. It's still a bit of a mystery why they have this strange feature, but it also presents some challenges that gastropods have had to adapt to. One is that by twisting the end of the digestive system around, bringing it close to the head, the anus is now very close to the gills. So you can imagine that's not ideal. That waste could contaminate the water being pulled into the mantle cavity and over the gills. You can see that a little bit better here. Notice the anus on the right side of the body and the gill on the left. They're very close to each other. But snails have a way of making sure only clean water is passing over that gill. Their siphon, which draws water into the mantle cavity, is on the opposite side as the anus. It draws water in, which then flows in one direction, over the gill, then out near the anus, helping to carry that waste away from the body. So this is one way water flow is really important for preventing that contamination of the gills. You may have noticed there's only one gill. Another adaptation in response to torsion is that for many organs, they're reduced or completely lost on one side of the body. Instead of a pair of gills or ctenidia, the right one has been completely lost. You can also see this in the gonads, with one of the gonads being completely lost to offset that imbalance. But there's a lot of variation in the degree to which gastropods of different species display torsion. In some species, even though they evolved from ancestors with torsion, it has been lost again over time. We can see that in their embryonic and larval development. The veliger larval stage still goes through torsion, twisting its body around. Then, as it matures, it untwists and loses that torsion. Just another example of how development can show us a lot about evolutionary history. If you think about a slug, they don't have a shell, so they don't have to deal with the imbalance in secretion of the shell by the mantle. So they don't really have a need to have this twisted anatomy. Most slugs have gone through some detorsion, so they don't show much torsion in their adult stage. If you look at this nudibranch or sea slug, which is a group we'll come back to later, you can see that the digestive tract runs straight through the body rather than looping around. So the anus is at the posterior end rather than up by the head. Now let's talk about feeding and digestion in gastropods. Again, in snails, that digestive system is going to be twisted. So you can see the path of the digestive system by looking at the white line drawn on this diagram. Still, like all the other bilaterians, they have a complete digestive system where food comes in through the mouth and waste is excreted through the anus, rather than just diffusing out. We already talked a little bit about the radula when we talked generally about mollusks. Remember that this is a structure found in the odontophore inside the pharynx. You can remember this by thinking of orthodontist. Dont means teeth. That's because the radula is a ribbon of teeth secreted by cells called odontoblasts in the odontophore. Those teeth are made of chitin, the same protein that makes up the exoskeletons of arthropods, and also the cell walls of fungi. In the odontophore, there are a set of muscles that can push the radula out of the mouth and pull it back in. This allows the gastropod to use it like a rasp, scraping or grinding food. But as it eats, those teeth wear down, so the odontoblasts continuously secrete new ones to replace them. In this video of a snail up against the glass of an aquarium, you'll see that toothed radula moving into and out of the mouth. So what is the gastropod scraping and grinding with this radula? They can have a wide range of diets. Many of them are herbivores or detritivores, but they can also be omnivores or even carnivores. And there are even some that are parasitic. Their radulas look really different depending on those diets. Here you can see a close-up of 6 different radulas from different gastropod species. For herbivores and detritivores, they mostly need to grind up their food so it's in small enough pieces for them to eat. Because of this, their radula is usually broad and has lots of rows of small teeth, like the one you see here. Or sometimes they can be a little more bristly. Predators need to be able to pierce or tear their prey, so they usually have a more narrow radula with larger teeth. Usually they use their foot to hold their prey still while they stab or tear at it with their radula. If you've ever been to the beach and found a shell with a perfect little hole drilled into it, that's usually evidence that that animal was killed and eaten by a predatory snail. Bivalves, which we'll talk about next, have very hard shells that can be completely closed to protect the animal inside. But some predatory snails are able to drill right through that shell to get at the clam or mussel inside. They use their radula like a drill, boring into that shell. But actually getting the prey out through that hole is a challenge. So they have specialized glands called boring glands that secrete acid. This acid helps break down the shell itself, making it easier for the snail to drill through it. Then, once it reaches the inside, the acid partially digests the prey right in its shell. Then the snail can just slurp it up through that small borehole. Sounds like a miserable way to go. And of course, there's endless variation in vertebrate groups. So we also have other weird and crazy adaptations to radulas in some species. One of these are predatory snails, who are able to use their radula like a harpoon to shoot their prey. I highly recommend watching this video because it's pretty cool. You're going to see the snail shoot the radula out of its body, pierce a fish, injecting it with venomous neurotoxins that paralyze it, and then it swallows the fish whole. Because this video has an ad, I'll let you click the link from the lecture slide so you can skip the ad. Go ahead and pause this and do that. So I mentioned there's some parasitic species of snails. There aren't a lot of them, but I wanted to show you some examples. You don't need to know these 2 examples, but they're still pretty interesting to learn about. This pretty little snail here is the Cooper's nutmeg, which is a parasite of the Pacific electric eel. It attaches itself to the eel and uses its radula to make a small cut in the eel's skin. Then it feeds on blood and other body fluids, so it's basically a little snail vampire. And there's some that are parasites of other invertebrates. Snails in the family Eulimidae are parasites on sea stars. Many of them attach themselves to the outside of the sea star and feed on them in a similar way to the eel parasites we just talked about. But others have lost their shells and become more worm-like and are actually internal parasites. So we talked about how solid waste left over as food passes through the digestive system is excreted through the anus. But gastropods also have a way to pull waste from their hemolymph, the body fluid, and excrete them. They do this using structures called nephridia, which are similar to our kidneys. The nephridia extract waste from the hemolymph and excrete them through an opening called the nephridiopore. In snails with torsion, this is another example of an organ that is often missing on one side. That nephridiopore is usually on the same side as the anus, again so those wastes don't contaminate the gill.